Imagine walking through the gaslit streets of Victorian London. The year is the 1800s. Horse-drawn carriages move slowly through the fog. Gentlemen in expensive suits walk beneath the glowing street lamps. Beautiful buildings rise above the crowded streets. From the outside, Victorian society appears elegant, controlled, and respectable. But hidden behind this image was another world, a world of secrets, private rooms, and forgotten stories that many people tried to ignore. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many history lovers and people avoiding sleep for questionable reasons gather here. Now, close your eyes and imagine opening a door into a world that existed just beneath the surface of Victorian society, a world where appearances meant everything, where a person's reputation could be destroyed by a single rumor, where elegance and hardship often existed side by side. Inside these hidden establishments were women whose lives were far more complicated than the simple stories history often tells. Some were searching for survival, some were trapped by circumstances, some became famous for their beauty, charm, and intelligence, and some disappeared from history completely. Behind the expensive clothing, the candlelit rooms, and the mysterious reputation was a reality filled with ordinary human emotions. Dreams, struggles, and choices made in a very different world. Tonight, we are stepping away from the myths and exploring what life was really like for Victorian brothel workers. We will uncover the hidden routines, the secrets of Victorian society, the seductive image people imagined, and the reality that existed behind closed doors. So get comfortable, let the modern world slowly fade away, and join me as we travel back into the mysterious streets of Victorian London. Because tonight, we discover what was it really like to be a Victorian brothel worker. As evening settled over London, the city transformed, coal smoke drifted through the air, church bells echoed softly in the distance. Along the grand avenues, wealthy families attended dinners and theatres, confident in the moral values they proudly displayed. Yet only a few streets away, another side of life quietly unfolded. Many respectable citizens preferred not to speak about it, newspapers hinted at it, politicians argued about it, clergymen condemned it, and ordinary people pretended not to notice. Still, everyone knew it existed. Hidden among ordinary houses were establishments that carefully blended into the city around them. Some appeared no different from neighboring homes. Curtains covered the windows, brass knockers shone beneath gas lamps, visitors entered quietly and departed just as discreetly. To passers-by, nothing seemed unusual. Inside, however, an entirely different world waited. Soft carpets muffled footsteps. Candles flickered against wallpaper decorated with flowers and gold patterns. Pianos played gentle melodies in drawing rooms filled with perfume and tobacco smoke. Conversations remained hushed. Laughter rose and faded. Everything was designed to create comfort, elegance, and illusion, because illusion mattered deeply in Victorian Britain. Appearances could protect fortunes, appearances could secure marriages. Appearances could preserve reputations, and sometimes appearances concealed painful realities. Behind the carefully arranged rooms lived women whose stories rarely appeared in official records. Their names were often forgotten, their voices seldom preserved, yet they existed. They laughed, they worried, they formed friendships, they dreamed of different futures. Unlike everyone else living beneath the long shadow of the British Empire, they faced uncertainties that history books often leave behind. But before understanding their lives, we must first step outside these doors once again, and wander through the streets that surrounded them, because Victorian London itself held secrets, and those secrets were waiting in the fog. As the night mist lingered above the rooftops, and the distant bells slowly faded into silence, our journey continues beyond those quiet doors, for to understand the hidden lives that existed within Victorian London, one must first understand the city itself, a place so enormous, so crowded, and so endlessly alive, that millions of stories unfolded side by side without ever truly touching. During the 19th century, London had become one of the largest cities on earth. Every day, new arrivals poured into its streets. Some came seeking prosperity, others came escaping hunger, loneliness, or disappointment, and many arrived carrying little more than hope. By sunrise, market carts rattled across uneven roads, milk sellers called to their customers, factory whistles echoed across the neighborhoods, and beneath the pale morning sky, countless ordinary people began another day. Yet London revealed itself differently depending on where one stood. In the elegant districts of Mayfair and Belgravia, wide avenues and beautiful townhouses reflected wealth and comfort. Servants polished silver, gardeners trimmed hedges, ladies prepared for afternoon visits. Everything seemed orderly and refined, but only a short carriage ride away, another world appeared. Narrow alleys twisted between crowded buildings, laundry hung from upper windows, street vendors shouted above the constant noise. Children played beside wagons and horses, the scent of coal smoke mixed with rain, river water, and the aromas drifting from bakeries and taverns. Life moved endlessly, and nowhere was truly quiet. As evening approached, London changed once more. Gas lamps flickered awake one by one. Their soft golden glow transformed the streets into something almost dreamlike. Fog drifted through the light, blurring shapes and softening corners. Footsteps echoed across cobblestones. Carriages rolled slowly through the darkness. Music escaped from theaters and music halls. Laughter rose from public houses. And behind carefully closed curtains, private lives unfolded unseen. For Victorian society lived according to appearances, respectability mattered greatly. People guarded their reputations with extraordinary care, neighbors watched one another, gossip traveled swiftly, and a single rumor could linger for years. Yet despite these concerns, London remained filled with contradictions. The city that celebrated morality also contained countless secrets. The same gentlemen who attended church on Sundays might quietly disappear into neighborhoods they never mentioned publicly. The same newspapers that condemned vice often reported on it with remarkable fascination, and while many preferred silence, certain streets acquired reputations everyone recognized, though few openly discussed them. In places such as Covent Garden, Soho, and parts of the East End, evening brought a different rhythm. Theaters emptied, restaurants welcomed wealthy guests, cab drivers waited patiently beneath the lamps. Musicians packed away their instruments, and amid the movement of the city, women walked the streets wrapped in shawls and long dresses, blending into the crowd. Most passers-by continued without a glance, others pretended not to notice. Discretion, after all, had become an art form. Nothing was ever spoken too plainly, nothing was ever acknowledged too directly. Even guidebooks occasionally hinted at districts that respectable travelers should avoid after dark, yet curiosity often proved stronger than caution. Visitors from abroad frequently remarked upon London's strange mixture of grandeur and mystery. Some described the city as magnificent, others called it overwhelming, but nearly everyone agreed on one thing: London possessed countless hidden layers, and somewhere among those layers, behind ordinary doors, beneath polished chandeliers, and beyond the carefully maintained image of Victorian respectability, there existed a world many knew about, but few truly understood, a world that history often reduced to whispers, But before we enter those quiet rooms, before we meet the women whose lives unfolded within them, we must pause for a moment and remember something easily forgotten. These stories were not fairy tales, they belonged to real people, people with fears, hopes, families, and memories, and among them were countless women whose names have long vanished into the fog of time, women history itself seemed to leave behind, and it is there, among those forgotten voices, that our journey will continue. As the fog settled softly over the sleeping city, and the sounds of carriage wheels gradually faded into the distance, our attention drifts away from the streets themselves, and toward the people who quietly moved through them, for while Victorian London left behind countless photographs, newspapers, and grand monuments, many of the women who lived within its shadows left behind almost nothing at all, no portraits hanging in museums, no memoirs resting on library shelves, no statues carved in their memory, in many cases, not even a gravestone bearing their names. History, after all, has always had its favorites, kings and queens, inventors and generals, politicians and industrialists. Their stories were carefully preserved, their letters saved, their achievements celebrated, but ordinary people, especially women living difficult and unconventional lives, often disappeared into silence, and yet they were everywhere, not merely names in old police reports, not simply numbers hidden inside census records, but human beings, women who once laughed over tea, women who worried about rent, women who missed their families, women who dreamed of better fortunes and brighter tomings. Some were astonishingly young, barely older than girls, others had already lived through marriages, widowhood, or years of hardship. There was no single story, no one path, no simple explanation. Many had grown up in villages far from London, small places where church bells marked the hours and neighbors knew one another by name, but changing times brought uncertainty. Factories transformed old ways of life, families struggled, employment vanished, and sometimes the great city itself seemed to promise opportunity. London drew people toward it like a great tide, and once they arrived, some discovered that reality looked very different from hope. For women especially, choices were often painfully limited. A governess could lose her position, a servant might be dismissed without warning. Illness could destroy a family's savings, a father's death could leave children without support, even a damaged reputation might close doors forever. Victorian society valued respectability deeply, but respectability offered little comfort when hunger entered the room. And so countless women found themselves navigating circumstances that historians still struggle to fully understand. Some shared rented rooms with sisters and friends, others sent money home to aging parents, many formed close bonds with one another, because survival often depended on friendship. Letters from the period reveal unexpected moments of kindness, women lending dresses, sharing meals, caring for one another during illness, celebrating birthdays with small cakes and candles, laughing together after long days, tiny moments, ordinary moments, that history rarely records, and perhaps that is what makes these forgotten lives feel strangely familiar, because beneath the strange customs and distant century, their emotions were not so different from our own. They experienced loneliness, embarrassment, hope, regret, love, fear, and countless quiet dreams never spoken aloud. Some imagined opening small shops, others hoped to marry, some longed simply for peace, for security, for an ordinary life free from uncertainty, but dreams often collided with reality. The city could be unforgiving, and Victorian society rarely offered second chances. Once certain lines had been crossed, whether by poverty, scandal, or circumstance, returning to respectability became increasingly difficult. And perhaps that is why so many women vanished from the historical record, not because they lacked importance, but because few people considered their stories worth preserving. Official records reduced lives to occupations and addresses. Newspapers preferred scandal over understanding. And society itself often looked away, yet occasionally a photograph survives, or an old letter, or a faded entry inside a forgotten ledger, tiny fragments, whispers from another age, enough to remind us that behind every statistic stood a person, a woman who once walked beneath these same skies, who felt the rain, who heard the church bells, who sat beside candlelight wondering what tomorrow might bring. And as we move deeper into this hidden world, another question quietly begins to emerge. How did these women arrive here in the first place? What circumstances, what disappointments, what impossible choices led them toward lives Victorian society preferred not to discuss? The answer, like so much in history, is far more complicated than simple judgment, and it begins with survival itself. As the candle flames burned lower, and the forgotten names of the past slowly faded back into the shadows, another question begins to quietly emerge, one that Victorian society often answered with harsh judgment, and one that history itself sometimes oversimplified. Why did some women enter this hidden world? The answer, as with so many human stories, rarely fits neatly into simple categories. For life in 19th century Britain could change with frightening speed. Fortunes rose and disappeared, illness visited without warning, and security, especially for women, was often far more fragile than appearances suggested. A single event, a single misfortune, could alter the course of an entire life. Some women arrived in London carrying dreams, dreams of employment, dreams of independence, dreams inspired by stories told in distant villages where the great city seemed almost magical. Factories promised wages, households advertised positions, shops required assistance, and for many young women, London represented opportunity, but opportunities did not always last. Domestic service, one of the most common occupations available to women, demanded long hours and strict obedience. Servants rose before sunrise. They scrubbed floors, prepared meals, polished silver, and often lived under constant supervision. Dismissal could come suddenly, sometimes over misunderstandings, sometimes because employers moved away, and occasionally, for reasons never fully explained, without references. Finding another position became increasingly difficult. For others, tragedy opened the door to uncertainty. The death of a parent, a failed family business, an injured husband unable to work, a younger brother needing support. The responsibilities of survival frequently fell upon women's shoulders, and wages in many respectable occupations barely covered necessities. Seamstresses labored endlessly for tiny payments. Factory workers endured exhausting conditions. Shop assistants worked endless hours, yet despite their efforts, many remained only one missed payment away from disaster. Victorian London itself offered little protection. There were no modern safety nets, no unemployment benefits, no emergency assistance waiting to catch those who fell. Poverty could arrive quietly, and once it appeared, escaping its grasp proved difficult. Some women made choices that outsiders struggled to understand, not because they lacked morality, but because hunger, loneliness, and desperation often changed the meaning of choice itself. Survival has always asked difficult questions, questions without easy answers, and many women faced them entirely alone. Others were introduced to this secretive world through acquaintances. A friend, a cousin, a former co-worker. Someone who promised security, elegant surroundings, or simply a place to sleep. Sometimes those promises proved genuine, sometimes they concealed unpleasant realities. Not every woman entered willingly. And not every story followed the same path. Human lives rarely do. Love also played unexpected roles. Certain women followed men who later abandoned them. Others found themselves cast aside after relationships that Victorian society considered scandalous. Respectability, once damaged, could be nearly impossible to restore. Doors closed, employers refused applications, neighbors whispered, and isolation grew. Yet perhaps the most surprising truth lies elsewhere. Many women who entered this world did not initially believe they would remain there. Some expected only temporary arrangements, a few weeks, a month, long enough to repay debts, long enough to survive difficult times. But temporary solutions often stretched into years, and gradually new routines formed. New friendships appeared, new identities emerged, life continued, because human beings possess remarkable abilities to adapt, to endure, to find moments of laughter even during uncertainty, and despite everything, many women still carried hopes for the future. Some dreamed of marriage, others imagined owning businesses, a few saved money carefully, planning for entirely different lives, for beneath society's assumptions, beneath the rumors and whispered judgments, stood ordinary people attempting to navigate extraordinary circumstances, people making choices shaped by a world very different from our own. And somewhere amid the endless movement of Victorian London, behind polished doors and heavy curtains, new arrivals continued to appear, young women uncertain of what awaited them, women stepping into unfamiliar rooms, wondering whether they had found safety or whether they had entered something far more complicated. And for those standing upon that threshold, the first days inside would leave impressions they would never forget, for beyond the elegant wallpaper and glowing candlelight, another reality patiently waited, one that revealed itself slowly, one quiet evening at a time. As evening shadows stretched quietly across the city, and gas lamps awakened one by one beneath the drifting fog, the threshold that had once seemed so uncertain finally lay behind them. For many women arriving for the first time, there was no grand announcement, no dramatic moment, only the sound of a door closing softly, and the strange realization that life had entered unfamiliar territory. The first impressions often surprised newcomers. From the outside, many houses appeared perfectly ordinary, respectable, even. Their windows were curtained, their steps carefully swept. Nothing announced their purpose to the world, and perhaps that was precisely the intention. Discretion had value, secrecy had value, appearances, above all, had value. Inside, the atmosphere felt curiously calm. Soft carpets covered the floors, clocks ticked quietly upon mantels, candles flickered against wallpaper decorated with flowers and vines, pianos rested in parlors where conversations rose and faded in gentle tones, perfume mingled with the scent of tea, polished wood, and coal fires. For some young women, the surroundings felt almost comforting, certainly more comfortable than overcrowded lodging houses or damp rented rooms. Yet beneath the warmth and elegance, uncertainty lingered, because first impressions rarely revealed everything. The women already living there varied greatly. Some had spent years in the house, others had arrived only recently. There were friendships, rivalries, quiet alliances, and unspoken rules understood by everyone. New arrivals often found themselves carefully observed, not with cruelty, necessarily, but with curiosity. Everyone remembered their own first days, everyone remembered the confusion, and perhaps because of that, certain older residents extended unexpected kindness, a borrowed dress, a shared meal, advice whispered. Late at night, small gestures that eased unfamiliar fears. The routines themselves soon became apparent. Mornings tended to be peaceful, curtains remained closed against the daylight, breakfasts arrived late, Conversations unfolded lazily over tea. Some women read newspapers, others mended clothing. Letters from distant relatives might be reread beside fireplaces. The world outside continued its hurried pace, while inside, time seemed to move differently. Afternoons brought preparation. Hair arranged carefully, dresses selected, shoes polished, not out of vanity alone, but because presentation held enormous importance. Appearance could influence fortunes, appearance could determine opportunities, and appearance formed part of the illusion that Victorian society valued so deeply. Still, behind mirrors and ribbons, human emotions remained. Some newcomers felt relief that they no longer worried about where they would sleep. Others experienced loneliness, homesickness, regret, or simply exhaustion after years of uncertainty. Many emotions existed side by side, and often they changed from day to day. The house itself possessed its own rhythms. Certain rooms remained quiet sanctuaries. Others bustled with activity. The kitchen frequently became the heart of daily life. There, women gathered over simple meals, shared gossip, complained about the weather, exchanged stories from childhood, and for brief moments, life felt almost ordinary. Which perhaps seems surprising, yet ordinary moments exist even within extraordinary circumstances. That has always been true. Outside these walls, Victorian society imagined countless fantasies. Newspapers painted scandalous pictures, rumors exaggerated endlessly, but inside, much of life consisted of familiar human experiences: waiting, talking, laughing, worrying, dreaming, and slowly adapting, because adaptation often arrives quietly, not all at once, but through small routines repeated day after day. Still, certain realities remained impossible to ignore. The elegant surroundings came with expectations, the comforts came with obligations, and beneath the soft candlelight and polished furniture, unspoken rules governed nearly everything, rules newcomers gradually learned. Rules that shaped daily life, rules enforced not by distant authorities, but by the women and landladies who controlled the house itself. And for those experiencing their first days beneath these roofs, understanding those invisible boundaries became essential, because behind every pleasant conversation, behind every beautiful room, and behind every carefully maintained smile, there existed a structure few outsiders ever truly saw. A structure hidden behind closed doors. Where order mattered, where reputation mattered, and where breaking the rules could change everything. As the candles burned steadily into the evening, and familiar faces gathered once again beneath the quiet glow of the parlor lamps, the newcomers slowly began to understand something important. Behind the elegance, behind the soft carpets and carefully chosen wallpaper, life inside these houses was not without structure, far from it, because every household, whether grand or humble, operated according to its own customs. And these hidden establishments were no different. In fact, order mattered greatly. Without it, tensions rose, arguments multiplied, and the delicate balance that sustained daily life could quickly unravel. The rules themselves were not written in books, nor displayed upon walls. Instead, they passed quietly from woman to woman, through observation, through whispered advice, and sometimes, through mistakes. New arrivals soon learned when breakfast was served, which rooms were private, who preferred silence in the mornings, and which subjects were best avoided altogether. These small understandings helped preserve peace among people living closely together, because shared lives required patience, and patience, in turn, demanded courtesy. Punctuality mattered, cleanliness mattered, respect mattered, dresses needed proper care, bedrooms were expected to remain orderly, personal disagreements were rarely encouraged. And while friendships flourished, Harmony within the household often took priority over individual grievances. The landlady, of course, occupied a unique position. Her authority shaped much of daily life. Some women remembered strict but fair mistresses, others recalled figures who inspired admiration, and some remembered women whose tempers could darken entire evenings. No two houses were identical, no two personalities entirely alike. Yet nearly everywhere, the landlady's word carried weight. Finances also introduced their own quiet rules. Money flowed through the household in complicated ways. Expenses for clothing, meals, candles, laundry, and countless necessities accumulated steadily. Careful records were often maintained. Ledgers sat tucked inside desks, names and figures written neatly in ink. For some women, understanding these accounts became essential. For others, the numbers remained confusing and difficult to escape. But beyond practical concerns, there existed another set of rules, unspoken rules, the kind found in nearly every human community. Loyalty mattered, discretion mattered, and trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. Secrets remained secrets. Private conversation stayed private. The outside world already judged harshly enough. Inside the house, many women preferred to protect one another whenever possible. Unexpected friendships grew from these shared understandings. Women borrowed books from one another, exchanged recipes, shared stories of childhood homes, and celebrated small holidays together. Christmas dinners, birthdays remembered with modest cakes, evenings spent listening to music beside the fire, moments that transformed strangers into companions. Yet beneath the warmth of companionship, there remained a quiet awareness. Everyone understood that life could change quickly. Illness, financial troubles, police raids, changing fortunes, uncertainty lingered like the London fog itself. And because uncertainty never disappeared entirely, household routines became anchors. Predictable habits offered comfort, familiar faces offered reassurance. People clung to ordinary things because ordinary things brought peace. Still, mistakes happened, arguments occurred. Human beings, after all, have never been perfect. Jealousies occasionally surfaced. Misunderstandings created tensions. And not every house provided kindness or stability. Some women encountered harsh realities that differed greatly from the graceful image outsiders imagined. Because appearances could deceive, beautiful rooms did not guarantee happiness, fine curtains could not hide every sorrow. And beneath polished surfaces, complicated emotions quietly endured. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these hidden rules was how ordinary they often seemed. For despite the secrecy surrounding these houses, their inhabitants worried about familiar concerns: laundry, meals, friendships, money, reputation, concerns not so different from those found in countless homes throughout history. And while newcomers gradually adapted to these invisible customs, another world within Victorian society was waiting to reveal itself, a world shaped not by survival alone, but by beauty, education, conversation, and carefully cultivated charm. For among the many women who lived behind these doors, some occupied a very different place altogether. Women whose names appeared in newspapers, women admired by artists and noblemen, women known by another title entirely. The Victorian courtesans, and their lives, were wrapped in elegance, mystery, and illusions all their own. As another quiet evening settled over London, and the soft notes of a distant piano drifted through candlelit rooms, our story begins to move toward a different corner of Victorian society, a world that fascinated newspapers, inspired artists, and filled ordinary people with endless curiosity. For among the countless women whose lives unfolded behind closed doors, There existed a small and unusual group whose names occasionally reached far beyond the hidden streets. They were known as courtesans, and in the imagination of Victorian society, they occupied a place somewhere between admiration and scandal. To outsiders, their lives appeared almost enchanted. Their gowns were described in newspapers. Their jewels sparked envy. Their names were whispered inside theaters, restaurants, and fashionable drawing rooms. Some even became minor celebrities, but appearances, as we have already discovered, rarely revealed the whole truth. Unlike many women who struggled simply to survive, successful courtesans often cultivated an entirely different identity. Conversation mattered, charm mattered, education mattered. Beauty alone was never considered enough. A woman who could discuss literature, music, politics, or foreign travel possessed a certain advantage, and so some spent hours reading books, practicing languages, learning etiquette, studying art, or mastering the graceful social customs expected by wealthy Victorian gentlemen. In many ways, they became performers, not upon stages, but within society itself. Their lives revolved around appearances carefully constructed and constantly maintained, elegant dresses, perfect manners, flattering smiles, an effortless air of confidence. Everything formed part of the image, yet maintaining such an image required endless work. Hair arrangements could take hours, fashion changed constantly, new fabrics arrived from Paris, jewelry had to impress, and every detail, from gloves to perfumes, carried significance, because among the upper classes, elegance itself had become a language. And courtesans learned to speak it fluently. Some occupied luxurious apartments, others maintained servants, a few enjoyed extraordinary wealth, carriages waited outside their residences, flowers arrived daily, their portraits were painted, poets dedicated verses to them, and newspapers reported their movements with remarkable fascination. To ordinary observers, these women seemed to possess freedom unavailable to many others, yet freedom often came with uncertainty. Fortunes could disappear quickly, relationships changed, public admiration proved fickle, and beauty, which Victorian society valued so highly, was seen as something temporary. One scandal, one rumor, one powerful admirer losing interest, and fortunes could shift overnight. Many courtesans understood this reality perfectly, which perhaps explains why some invested money wisely, a few purchased property, others opened businesses, some quietly prepared for futures beyond their years of glamour. Because beneath the diamonds and silk, there often remained practical women who understood how unpredictable life could be, and loneliness, strangely enough, visited even the most celebrated among them. Lavish dinners and expensive gifts could not guarantee companionship. Trust became difficult, affection sometimes blurred with financial arrangements, and genuine friendships proved precious. Certain women formed close circles among themselves, sharing confidences, offering advice, protecting one another from gossip and disappointments. Together they navigated a society that admired beauty, while simultaneously condemning those who possessed too much of it. Victorian Britain loved contradictions. It celebrated refinement, yet secretly consumed scandal. It praised morality, yet endlessly discussed temptation, and nowhere did those contradictions appear more clearly than in the lives of famous courtesans. Artists painted them, writers described them, men pursued them, and newspapers criticized them, sometimes all at once. Still, beneath every grand carriage and glittering necklace stood a human being, someone who worried about the future, someone who laughed with friends, someone who remembered childhood dreams, someone who occasionally sat alone beside candlelight, wondering what tomorrow might bring, because no amount of elegance could entirely erase uncertainty, and perhaps that was the greatest secret hidden beneath Victorian luxury, the beautiful image people admired, and the private reality that existed beneath it, were often two very different things, and as our journey continues, we begin to discover that the seductive picture Victorian society imagined was not always the truth, for illusion, like fog upon the London streets, could hide many things, and behind the image another reality quietly waited. As midnight settled gently over the city, and London's endless murmur softened beneath the drifting fog, the images that Victorian society loved so dearly continued to shine, images of beauty, images of temptation, images carefully painted by newspapers, novels, and whispered conversations. For many respectable citizens, the hidden world remained something distant and mysterious, something discussed quietly, imagined endlessly, and rarely understood. People loved stories, and Victorian Britain was no exception. Illustrated magazines filled their pages with romantic fantasies. Popular novels described glamorous women draped in silk and jewels. Playwrights created tragic heroines and dangerous beauties. Artists painted elegant portraits filled with mystery and longing. These images fascinated the public, but fascination and understanding are not always the same thing, because reality, as history so often reminds us, rarely behaves like fiction. Behind the polished image existed something far more ordinary and far more human. Many houses that inspired scandalous rumors were surprisingly quiet places. Afternoons passed slowly. Tea kettles whistled, clothing required mending. Letters arrived from distant relatives, coal fires needed tending, and women sat together discussing weather, family memories, or neighborhood gossip. Life, even in unusual circumstances, remained filled with ordinary moments. There were rainy days, cold winters, sleepless nights, unexpected illnesses, and small joys hidden among everyday routines. The grand fantasies imagined by outsiders often overlooked these simple truths, because ordinary life rarely captures the imagination as powerfully as mystery. Newspapers preferred sensational headlines, readers preferred shocking tales, and rumors grew larger with every retelling. Entire myths developed around women whom most people had never actually met. Strangers projected fantasies upon lives they barely understood, and once stories became popular, truth often struggled to catch up. Some believed every woman lived surrounded by luxury, others imagined endless tragedy. Neither image captured the full reality, for human experiences are rarely so simple. Within the same house, one woman might dream of opening a bakery, another worried constantly about aging parents, someone else saved money for a different future, and another simply hoped tomorrow would bring peace. Different hopes, different fears, different lives. Yet Victorian society often preferred labels over understanding. Labels simplified complicated stories. Labels allowed people to judge from a distance, and distance, perhaps, made uncomfortable truths easier to ignore. Curiously, many women themselves became skilled at maintaining illusions, not out of deception alone, but because appearances offered protection. A graceful smile could conceal sadness, fine clothing could disguise uncertainty, confidence could hide fear. In this respect, they were hardly different from countless others throughout history, for people everywhere have worn invisible masks, masks created by necessity, masks created by pride, masks created by survival, and perhaps nowhere were these masks more important than in Victorian society, where reputation could determine one's entire future. The illusion extended beyond the women themselves. Clients maintained appearances, landladies protected appearances, neighbors pretended not to notice, even officials sometimes looked away. Everyone participated, in one form or another. In a strange dance of silence, a society built upon what was seen, and equally upon what remained hidden, yet beneath every performance, beneath every carefully chosen dress, and beneath every whispered rumor, there remained ordinary human emotions: kindness, loneliness, hope, embarrassment, laughter, regret, feelings that no amount of glamour could erase. And perhaps that is what history asks us to remember: not the fantasies, not the scandals, but the people. Because long after newspapers fade and rumors disappear, human stories endure, and those stories often reveal truths far gentler and far more complicated than legends suggest. Still, Victorian society placed enormous importance on appearances. Beauty itself became a kind of currency. Fashion transformed identities, cosmetics created illusions, and elegance, whether genuine or carefully constructed, possessed extraordinary power. For in the gaslit world of 19th century London, beauty was never simply beauty, it was performance, it was protection, and sometimes it was survival. And behind every ribbon, every perfume bottle, and every carefully arranged curl, another layer of illusion patiently waited to be revealed. As the final candles of evening flickered softly against the wallpaper, and the gentle sounds of the city drifted upward from the streets below, another layer of Victorian life slowly reveals itself, not through whispered conversations, nor through scandalous headlines, but through mirrors, through fabrics, and through the quiet rituals of appearance, because in Victorian society, beauty was never simply a matter of vanity, it carried meaning. It communicated status, and sometimes it offered a kind of protection in a world that judged harshly and remembered endlessly. Long before the first visitors arrived, many women spent hours preparing themselves for the evening ahead. Not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with patience, almost like artists standing before unfinished paintings. Hair was perhaps the greatest source of pride. Long curls, soft waves, delicate arrangements secured with ribbons and jeweled pins, styles changed with fashion, and women followed these changes closely. Magazines arriving from Paris introduced new trends, illustrations inspired fresh ideas, and mirrors reflected not only appearances, but hopes, for appearance itself could shape opportunity. Dresses held their own language. Rich silks and velvets signaled elegance, soft lace suggested refinement, colors carried meaning: deep burgundy, emerald green, ivory cream, faded blue, each shade carefully chosen to flatter candlelight and create an impression of effortless beauty. But effortless beauty, as many women knew, required considerable effort. Corsets shaped silhouettes according to the ideals of the age, gloves completed outfits, shoes were polished meticulously, perfumes, often floral or citrus-scented, added subtle touches that lingered gently in drawing rooms. Nothing was accidental, every detail mattered, yet behind the elegance existed practical realities. Dresses required endless maintenance, fabric tore, buttons loosened, shoes wore thin, and many garments were altered repeatedly rather than replaced. Women exchanged sewing techniques, shared ribbons, borrowed jewelry, and transformed old gowns into something entirely new. Resourcefulness often proved as valuable as fashion itself. Cosmetics during the Victorian era occupied an unusual place. Respectable society publicly favored natural beauty. Too much visible makeup risked attracting criticism, and so many women relied upon subtle methods: rosewater, cold creams, homemade lotions, powders carefully applied beneath soft candlelight. Beauty, after all, was expected to appear effortless, even when great effort stood behind it. Perhaps this contradiction perfectly reflected Victorian values. Everything was expected to appear graceful, orderly, natural, even when reality required endless work, and yet, beauty served purposes beyond appearance alone. For some women, dressing elegantly restored confidence. For others, it provided a sense of identity, a reminder that hardship had not completely erased dignity. A carefully chosen ribbon, a favorite necklace, or a cherished perfume bottle might hold emotional significance invisible to outsiders. These small objects carried memories, fragments of happier times, gifts from friends, tokens from childhood, or reminders of dreams still waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Mirrors themselves became strange companions, reflecting not only faces, but the passing years, the hopes of youth, the quiet fears that accompanied growing older, because Victorian society valued youth and beauty with remarkable intensity. And many women understood that fashion changed, fortunes changed. Admiration changed, time itself changed, nothing remained forever. Still, amid all the ribbons and perfumes, amid all the lace and polished shoes, there remained something no mirror could fully capture. Personality, kindness, intelligence, humor, qualities that often mattered far more within the walls of everyday life than newspapers or strangers could ever understand, and perhaps that is why certain women left such lasting impressions, not because of jewels, not because of gowns, but because people remembered the warmth of their laughter, the gentleness of their words, or the quiet confidence they carried into every room. Yet outside those candlelit parlors, another group observed these carefully crafted images with fascination, men of influence, men of wealth, men whose public reputations demanded respectability, even as their private lives wandered into hidden corners of London. And as another carriage rolled quietly through the fog, their stories, too, were beginning to unfold. As the fog thickened once again over the gaslit streets of London, and the distant sound of carriage wheels echoed between narrow alleys and grand avenues, another side of Victorian society quietly comes into view, a side rarely discussed openly, yet deeply intertwined with the world we have been exploring, for these hidden establishments did not exist in isolation. They were connected to the very heart of Victorian wealth, power, and reputation, and among those who crossed their thresholds were men who, in daylight, appeared entirely respectable: bankers, politicians, military officers, merchants, even men of nobility. By day, they occupied offices filled with paperwork and responsibility. They attended meetings, signed contracts, made decisions that influenced entire industries, and walked through society with carefully maintained dignity. But by night, London's fog seemed to soften distinctions, it blurred identities, it hid footsteps, and it allowed even the most disciplined lives to slip quietly into different versions of themselves. The city itself made this possible. Its size offered anonymity. Its darkness offered protection, and its silence between gas lamps offered secrecy. Many of these men lived lives divided into two halves, one visible, one hidden. In public, they were husbands, fathers, and respected members of society. In private, they entered spaces that existed far from the scrutiny of daylight. And yet, Victorian society rarely spoke of this contradiction directly. Instead, it preferred silence, or vague judgment, or carefully coded language in newspapers that hinted at behavior without naming it outright. Inside these hidden rooms, conversations unfolded differently than in the outside world. There was no business to conduct, no public reputation to maintain, no formal expectations of society, only temporary escape from the weight of obligation. Some men came seeking companionship, others came seeking novelty, and a few came simply seeking anonymity in a world that constantly demanded performance. But even within these spaces, class distinctions remained visible. Wealth influenced treatment. Appearance influenced attention, and status, even when unspoken, shaped every Interaction. Victorian society never truly disappeared behind closed doors, it simply changed form. Still, many men experience these visits as moments of contrast, the same individuals who navigated rigid social expectations during the day sometimes encountered a different kind of reality at night. One that felt less structured, less predictable, and in some cases, strangely human. Yet these experiences were rarely discussed afterward, because silence was part of the arrangement. Discretion protected reputations, reputations protected careers, and careers protected entire families, so life continued in carefully separated layers, public and private, visible and hidden, declared and unspoken. Even letters from the period suggest this duality, polite correspondence during daylight hours, subtle references or coded language in private notes, hints of meetings that were never openly acknowledged, everything carefully contained, everything carefully controlled. And yet, despite this careful separation, rumors still traveled. London was too large to be fully private, too connected to remain entirely secret. Stories passed through servants, through carriage drivers, through whispers in public houses, and sometimes through accidental recognition beneath gaslit streets. But even then, society rarely confronted the truth directly, because acknowledging it too openly would require acknowledging something uncomfortable. That respectability and secrecy often existed side by side, and that the boundaries between them were not as solid as people like to believe. Still, within these hidden encounters, human complexity remained. Not every interaction followed the same pattern, not every visitor behaved the same way, and not every story ended the same. Some moments were brief, others lingered in memory, some were transactional. Others carried unexpected emotional weight, but all existed within a world shaped by unspoken agreements, agreements that Victorian society understood, but preferred not to examine too closely. And as the night deepened across London, carriages continued to move through the fog. Some returning home, some heading toward grand houses filled with waiting families, and others slipping quietly back into the hidden corners of the city, carrying with them the unspoken contradictions of their lives. Because in Victorian London, nothing was ever entirely separate, every world touched another, every secret had its shadow, and every illusion was held together by silence. As the night deepened over London, and the last echoes of carriage wheels faded into the mist, something quieter begins to reveal itself, not a place, not a building, but a system, a way of speaking without speaking, a language made not of words alone, but of silence, gesture, and carefully chosen appearances. For Victorian society rarely said things directly. It preferred suggestion, it preferred implication, and above all, it preferred control over what could be openly acknowledged. In drawing rooms filled with candlelight and polished furniture, conversation often moved carefully around sensitive subjects. Topics were not forbidden, but softened, reframed. Disguised in polite phrasing, a scandal might be referred to as unfortunate circumstances. A questionable reputation might become a complicated past. And entire lives could be summarized in a single cautious sentence. What was spoken mattered, but what was left unsaid mattered even more. A raised eyebrow could communicate more than a paragraph. A pause at the wrong moment could shift the tone of an entire conversation. Even silence itself carried meaning. In this world, understanding required attention to subtle detail. Not everyone was expected to grasp it, but those who did moved more easily through society's invisible boundaries. Letters, too, reflected this careful style. Victorian correspondence often appears formal on the surface, yet between its lines, meaning sometimes hides. A polite phrase could carry disappointment, a restrained sentence might conceal urgency. And a carefully chosen word could signal far more than it seemed to say. Even invitations followed patterns of meaning: who was included, who was excluded, who was invited privately rather than publicly. Each detail formed part of a quiet social code. Clothing also contributed to this language. A dress worn too brightly might suggest boldness, a more subdued tone might indicate respectability, jewelry could signal wealth, or taste, or restraint. Even the way someone entered a room mattered: how long they paused at the doorway, who they greeted first, how they held their posture. Everything was observed, everything was interpreted, and everything, in some way, communicated status. Servants understood this language as well. They observed households closely, they noticed patterns, they interpreted moods from footsteps and tone of voice, and though they rarely spoke of it openly, they often understood far more than their employers realized. Newspapers added another layer to this system. Editors wrote cautiously, articles hinted rather than declared, and readers learned to interpret meaning beneath the surface of polite reporting. Victorian Britain, in many ways, operated on dual understanding: one visible, one hidden, one spoken, one implied, and within this structure, privacy itself became a carefully managed performance. Even emotions were sometimes shaped by expectation. Grief had its acceptable forms, joy had its appropriate expressions, and anger, if displayed too openly, risked social consequences. People learned to contain themselves, to edit their reactions, to present the version of themselves that society considered acceptable. But beneath these layers of restraint, human nature remained unchanged. People still felt deeply, still reacted instinctively, still struggled with desires that could not always be expressed openly, and so the secret language of Victorian society emerged not from deception alone, but from necessity, a way to survive within strict expectations, a way to communicate without breaking rules, a way to navigate a world where reputation carried enormous weight. Yet even within this structured silence, there were places where the language shifted again, where rules softened, where identities became less rigid, and where conversation, though still shaped by society, carried a different tone. Those places existed in the hidden corners of London, behind doors that opened quietly at night, where meanings were understood differently, and where another kind of social order quietly took shape, one shaped not only by class, but by secrecy itself. And as we move deeper into this hidden world, we begin to see that Victorian society was not simply divided between respectable and forbidden. It was layered, complex, and full of unspoken agreements that held everything together. Even silence was part of the language. As the fog drifted slowly through the sleeping streets of London, and the gas lamps burned with their steady, golden glow, the hidden world we have been tracing begins to reveal its structure more clearly, because behind every carefully maintained house, behind every quiet routine, and behind every rule whispered in passing conversations, there was always someone at the center: the landlady, a figure often overlooked in public imagination, yet absolutely essential to how these houses functioned. She was not simply an observer of daily life, she was its organizer, its regulator, and, in many ways, its silent authority. To outsiders, she might have appeared as nothing more than a respectable woman managing a household. But within the walls of these hidden establishments, her presence shaped everything, from the arrangement of rooms, to the timing of daily routines, to the behavior expected from those who lived under her roof. Nothing was entirely outside her influence. Some landladies were older women who had experienced many stages of life before arriving at this role. Others were sharp-minded and practical, understanding precisely how to manage both people and profit, and a few carried a quiet warmth, balancing discipline with unexpected kindness. No two were identical. but all understood the same truth: a house like this could only survive through order. Order required rules, and rules required enforcement. Daily life within these homes often reflected this structure in subtle ways. Meals appeared at specific times, rooms were assigned and maintained, expenses were tracked carefully, and expectations, though rarely spoken loudly, were understood clearly. The landlady often knew more than she said. She observed patterns. She noticed moods. She recognized changes in behavior long before they were spoken aloud. In many ways, she became the memory of the house itself, remembering who had arrived, who had left, and who had struggled along the way. Financial management formed another essential part of her role. Income and expenses moved constantly through the household: rent, food, candles, clothing, repairs, maintenance. Everything required attention. Some landladies kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers, writing each entry carefully by candlelight. Others relied on memory and experience, but all understood that stability depended upon balance. If order broke down, everything else followed. Yet authority alone did not define her. Many landladies also acted as mediators. When tensions rose between residents, when misunderstandings occurred, or when emotions became difficult to contain, she often stepped in quietly, sometimes with firm words, sometimes with calm reasoning, and sometimes simply with presence alone. Her role required both strength and discretion, because within such a confined world, conflict could not be allowed to linger too long. At times, she also provided unexpected support. A woman unwell might be given time to rest, a newcomer struggling to adjust might receive guidance, a difficult situation might be handled with more patience than outsiders would imagine. But kindness and control often existed side by side, for survival required both, and Victorian London itself offered little mercy outside these walls. There were no guarantees beyond them, no safety nets waiting beyond the fog, so the house became its own system of protection, however imperfect. Within this system, reputation remained fragile. Even internally, perception mattered. Trust had to be earned, reliability was observed, and consistency became one of the most valued qualities a person could show, because in a world shaped by uncertainty, stability felt like security. Still, not all landladies were gentle or understanding. Some ruled strictly, some demanded obedience without question, and others allowed little room for error. Life under such authority could feel heavy at times, yet even then, order persisted. And order, in Victorian London, often meant survival. Outside observers rarely saw these dynamics clearly. To them, the house was simply part of the city's hidden landscape. A place spoken of in rumors, described in vague moral terms, or ignored altogether. But inside, it was a living system, a small society governed by rules, personalities, and quiet negotiations, and the landlady stood at its center, balancing discipline with practicality, control with understanding, and authority with the constant unpredictability of human life. As the night deepened once more over London, candles continued to burn in upper windows, doors opened and closed softly, and life inside these houses moved forward, guided by hands that most of the city never saw. As the first pale light of morning began to dissolve the London fog, and the city slowly shifted from silence into motion, the hidden houses we have followed did not truly sleep, they simply changed rhythm, for within these walls, time did not follow the same pace as the outside world. Morning arrived gently, almost reluctantly, as if the night itself was reluctant to release its hold. Curtains remained drawn tight against the daylight. Candles, now reduced to thin stubs of wax, flickered their final moments before being extinguished, and the atmosphere inside softened into something quieter, slower, almost suspended. The early hours were rarely rushed. This was a time of recovery, of stillness, of small, ordinary tasks that held the structure of daily life together. Some women remained in bed longer than others, wrapped in blankets as the house gradually awakened. Others rose quietly, moving through corridors with careful steps so as not to disturb the calm. In the kitchen, tea was prepared slowly, kettles hissed gently over coal stoves, bread was sliced, simple meals were shared without ceremony. There was something almost ordinary in these moments. Something that might have belonged to any household in London, and perhaps that was what made them feel so human. Later in the morning, the house began to organize itself. Rooms were tidied, fabrics were folded. Wash basins were filled and emptied. Windows were occasionally opened just enough to let in fresh air. Though the chill of London often lingered stubbornly outside, small conversations took place in passing. A comment about the weather, a shared memory from the night before, a quiet laugh that faded quickly into stillness again. By midday, energy shifted slightly. The world outside was fully awake now. Carriages rolled through streets, markets opened, factories released their steady rhythm of labor, and within the house, preparations quietly began. This was the time of transformation. Hair was brushed and styled, dresses were chosen with care, shoes were polished, each detail considered not for extravagance alone, but for presentation, because appearance in Victorian society carried meaning far beyond fashion. It communicated identity, status, and intention. Yet even in these moments of preparation, there was no sense of urgency. Everything unfolded slowly, almost ritualistically. Mirrors reflected quiet concentration, hands moved with practiced familiarity, and conversation, when it occurred, remained soft and measured. Some women preferred solitude during these hours, others gathered in shared spaces, helping one another with ribbons, pins, and adjustments. Friendship often revealed itself in these small acts, a gentle correction of a collar, a borrowed piece of fabric, a reassuring word offered without expectation. As afternoon approached, the atmosphere shifted once again. The house grew still in a different way. Not resting now, but waiting. Waiting for movement, for change, for the unpredictable flow of visitors, conversations, and interactions that would shape the evening ahead. Yet even in this waiting, there was structure. Rules were quietly observed. Rooms were prepared, candles were checked and replaced. The household moved with practiced coordination. Nothing was left entirely to chance. And still, beneath all of it, life continued in its ordinary form. Meals were eaten, clothing was repaired, letters were read and occasionally written in response. Thoughts drifted toward families far away, toward villages, childhood memories, and futures that remained uncertain. Time passed gently, without sharp edges, without dramatic interruption, and as evening slowly began to gather once more beyond the windows, the house prepared itself for another transformation. For once again, the rhythm would shift. Once again, the world inside would separate from the world outside, and once again, the quiet routines of the day would give way to something far more complex. But for now, there was only stillness, the soft presence of ordinary life, held carefully within walls that contained far more than they revealed. As evening slowly returned to the streets of London, and gas lamps once again began to glow through the gathering mist, the houses we have followed seemed, from the outside, unchanged, elegant, quiet, composed beneath their curtains and polished doorways. But beneath that calm surface, there existed a fragile balance, one that could shift without warning. For every world built on discretion also carries its own vulnerabilities. And in Victorian London, nothing remained entirely safe for long. The dangers within these hidden houses were not always dramatic. They rarely announced themselves loudly. Instead, they arrived slowly, quietly, through uncertainty, misunderstanding, or chance. One of the most constant threats was instability. People came and went, circumstances changed, and what felt secure one week might feel uncertain the next. A house that seemed stable in the morning could feel different by nightfall, not through chaos, but through small, almost invisible shifts. A disagreement left unresolved, a financial concern quietly growing, a visitor whose intentions were unclear. These subtle changes shaped the emotional landscape of daily life. Then there was the constant presence of illness. Victorian medicine was still developing, many conditions were poorly understood, and recovery often depended more on rest and circumstance than cure. A simple cold could linger, fatigue could deepen. And in crowded urban environments, health was always fragile. Within these houses, women often cared for one another during sickness, tea brought to bedside tables, blankets adjusted in quiet rooms, soft conversation offered as comfort. Yet illness always carried uncertainty, and uncertainty, in a world without strong medical safety nets, created quiet anxiety beneath daily routines. Another danger came from the outside world itself. London was vast, but it was also watched. Authorities occasionally intervened, inspections happened without warning, rumors could draw attention, and attention, in Victorian society, was rarely neutral. It could bring consequences that affected not just individuals, but entire households. This meant discretion was not simply preference, it was survival. Every detail mattered, every interaction carried weight. Even ordinary conversations were shaped by awareness of how they might be interpreted beyond the room. But perhaps the most subtle danger was emotional. Living closely together created bonds, friendships formed quickly, trust developed through shared routines. Yet in such environments, emotions could also become complicated. Jealousy sometimes appeared quietly, misunderstandings could linger longer than intended, and attachment, when formed under uncertain conditions, often carried its own vulnerability, because nothing in this world was guaranteed to remain the same. Still, despite these undercurrents, daily life continued with remarkable steadiness. Meals were still shared, rooms were still maintained, conversation still drifted softly through candlelit spaces. Human beings have always possessed an ability to continue even when uncertainty exists beneath the surface, perhaps especially then, and within these houses, that ability became essential. The women who lived there developed an understanding of balance, between caution and comfort, between trust and awareness, between closeness and independence. It was not written anywhere, but it was learned slowly, through experience, and through time. Even the landlady, with all her authority, could not eliminate uncertainty entirely. She could only manage it, guide it, contain it when possible, but never fully remove it, because the world outside the house remained unpredictable, and the world inside reflected it in quieter ways. As night deepened once more, candles were lit carefully in hallways and rooms. Shadows moved gently along patterned walls, and behind every closed door, life continued in its delicate rhythm, part calm, part uncertain, always balancing between safety and fragility. And in that balance, the true nature of these hidden spaces becomes clearer. They were not simply places of secrecy, they were places of constant adjustment, where safety was never permanent, and where even the most ordinary moments carried a faint awareness of what might change next. As the city of London drifted deeper into night, and the soft rhythm of rain returned against the windows, a quieter story begins to surface within these hidden walls, a story not of arrival, not of routine, but of departure. For within every life shaped by circumstance, there are moments when the mind begins to wander elsewhere, to different streets, different rooms, different possibilities that feel distant, yet not entirely impossible. And in Victorian London, the idea of escape was always present, not always spoken aloud, but quietly understood. Some women thought about leaving after only a short time, others considered it after months had passed. And a few held the thought for years, like a small ember that refused to disappear completely. Escape, however, was rarely simple. The city itself made movement difficult, distances were vast, records existed, reputations followed quietly behind people like shadows, and opportunities outside were often uncertain. Still, the desire remained. Sometimes it appeared during quiet mornings, when the house was still. When thoughts drifted toward earlier lives, sometimes it came at night, when candlelight softened everything, and silence allowed memory to return more clearly. Some women imagined returning to their families, to villages far from London, to familiar fields and faces that once felt permanent. But return was not always possible. Time changed relationships. Distance changed understanding, and silence often replaced connection. Others dreamed of entirely new beginnings, a different city, a different name, a different identity. The idea of starting over held powerful appeal, especially in a world where the past carried weight, but beginning again required resources, connections, and luck. Not everyone had access to these things, and so plans often remained incomplete, quietly considered, but rarely realized. Yet there were moments when escape did occur, not always dramatically, sometimes simply through gradual separation, a change of employment, a move to another household, a quiet disappearance from familiar surroundings. In such a vast city, it was possible to become unknown again, at least for a time, and some women managed exactly that. They left behind the places they knew, stepped into unfamiliar districts, and slowly rebuilt new routines elsewhere. But even then, the memory of earlier years did not always fade. It remained present in subtle ways, in hesitation, in caution, in the careful way they observed new environments. Because experience, once gained, is rarely forgotten. For others, escape took a different form, not physical departure, but emotional distance, a quiet internal separation, a way of moving through daily life while holding parts of oneself apart from it. This too was a form of survival. And perhaps more common than history often acknowledges, friendships played an important role in these stories. Women sometimes encouraged one another to consider change, to save money, to plan quietly, to imagine alternatives. Hope, even when uncertain, often grew stronger when shared. Yet not all attempts succeeded. Some plans were interrupted by circumstance, some were delayed indefinitely, and some faded slowly over time, replaced by the demands of daily survival. Victorian London did not make transformation easy, but it did not make it entirely impossible either. It existed in a space of contradiction, restrictive, yet full of movement, harsh, yet full of hidden openings. And within that contradiction, lives continued to shift in unpredictable ways. What remains most striking in these stories is not only the desire to escape, but the persistence of hope itself, even in difficult conditions, even when outcomes were uncertain, even when the future felt unclear. Hope continued to appear, sometimes quietly, sometimes briefly, but always returning. And as the fog thickens once again over the city, we begin to see that escape was never just about leaving a place. It was about imagining something different, something beyond the present moment, something not yet defined. And in that imagination, many women found a small space of freedom, even when the world around them remained unchanged. As the city of London drifted deeper into night, and the soft rhythm of rain returned against the windows, a quieter story begins to surface within these hidden walls, a story not of arrival, not of routine, but of departure, for within every life shaped by circumstance, there are moments when the mind begins to wander elsewhere, to different streets, different rooms, different possibilities that feel distant, yet not entirely impossible. And in Victorian London, the idea of escape was always present, not always spoken aloud, but quietly understood. Some women thought about leaving after only a short time, others considered it after months had passed. And a few held the thought for years, like a small ember that refused to disappear completely. Escape, however, was rarely simple. The city itself made movement difficult, distances were vast, records existed, reputations followed quietly behind people like shadows, and opportunities outside were often uncertain. Still, the desire remained. Sometimes it appeared during quiet mornings, when the house was still. When thoughts drifted toward earlier lives, sometimes it came at night, when candlelight softened everything, and silence allowed memory to return more clearly. Some women imagined returning to their families, to villages far from London, to familiar fields and faces that once felt permanent. But return was not always possible. Time changed relationships, distance changed understanding, and silence often replaced connection. Others dreamed of entirely new beginnings, a different city, a different name, a different identity. The idea of starting over held powerful appeal, especially in a world where the past carried weight, but beginning again required resources, connections, and luck. Not everyone had access to these things, and so plans often remained incomplete, quietly considered, but rarely realized. Yet there were moments when escape did occur. Not always dramatically, sometimes simply through gradual separation, a change of employment, a move to another household, a quiet disappearance from familiar surroundings. In such a vast city, it was possible to become unknown again. At least for a time, and some women managed exactly that. They left behind the places they knew, stepped into unfamiliar districts, and slowly rebuilt new routines elsewhere. But even then, the memory of earlier years did not always fade. It remained present in subtle ways, in hesitation, in caution, in the careful way they observed new environments, because experience, once gained, is rarely forgotten. For others, escape took a different form, not physical departure, but emotional distance, a quiet internal separation, a way of moving through daily life while holding parts of oneself apart from it. This too was a form of survival, and perhaps more common than history often acknowledges. Friendships played an important role in these stories. Women sometimes encouraged one another to consider change, to save money, to plan quietly, to imagine alternatives. Hope, even when uncertain, often grew stronger when shared. Yet not all attempts succeeded. Some plans were interrupted by circumstance, some were delayed indefinitely, and some faded slowly over time, replaced by the demands of daily survival. Victorian London did not make transformation easy, but it did not make it entirely impossible either. It existed in a space of contradiction, restrictive, yet full of movement, harsh, yet full of hidden openings. And within that contradiction, lives continued to shift in unpredictable ways. What remains most striking in these stories is not only the desire to escape, but the persistence of hope itself, even in difficult conditions, even when outcomes were uncertain, even when the future felt unclear. Hope continued to appear, sometimes quietly, sometimes briefly, but always returning, and as the fog thickens once again over the city, we begin to see that escape was never just about leaving a place. It was about imagining something different, something beyond the present moment, something not yet defined, and in that imagination, many women found a small space of freedom even when the world around them remained unchanged. As the gas lamps burned steadily through another quiet Victorian night, and London's fog wrapped itself gently around stone buildings and iron railings, the story turns toward those few women whose lives briefly stepped beyond silence, women whose names, unlike many others, did not disappear entirely, because in a society built on strict expectations, there were always individuals who seemed to exist slightly outside its boundaries. Some were admired, some were criticized, and some were both at the same time. They moved through Victorian London like contradictions made flesh, fascinating to the public, yet judged by the same public that watched them so closely. Certain women became known not only within private circles, but also within newspapers, art studios, and fashionable salons. Their beauty was often described in great detail, their manners carefully observed, their presence discussed in tones that mixed admiration with moral caution. But behind the attention, there was always a more complicated reality. Many of these women possessed intelligence that extended far beyond appearances. They could read literature fluently, speak in more than one language, discuss music, philosophy, and politics with surprising ease. In a society where women's education was often limited, this alone made them stand out. Some used this education to navigate the world with greater independence. Others used it to build relationships with artists, writers, and influential figures of the time. Painters sought them as muses, poets wrote about them, and society, fascinated by beauty and mystery, elevated them into symbolic figures. Yet symbolism rarely captures a full human life, because behind every public image, there existed private moments that were rarely recorded. Quiet mornings, private doubts, unseen struggles, and the constant awareness that admiration could change quickly into criticism. Victorian society had a particular habit. It elevated women into idealized roles, then judged them for not remaining within those roles. A woman might be praised for elegance one day, and condemned for independence the next. This contradiction created a fragile space for those who lived under public attention. Some learned to carefully manage their image, controlling what was seen, what was spoken, and what remained hidden. Others allowed themselves moments of honesty that did not always align with public expectation, but either path carried risk. Still, within this tension, there were women who managed to carve out unusual degrees of influence. They attended artistic gatherings, engaged in intellectual circles, and sometimes shaped cultural conversations in ways that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. Their presence challenged assumptions about what women in Victorian society could be, not always openly, not always deliberately, but simply by existing in spaces that society had not fully defined for them. Yet, fame in this era was unpredictable. Newspapers could elevate a name quickly, and just as quickly shift tone. Admiration and criticism often existed side by side in the same article. Public fascination was powerful, but unstable, and many women understood this instability deeply, which is why some carefully balanced visibility with privacy, showing enough to remain relevant, while protecting what mattered most to them internally. Others could not maintain that balance, and their stories shifted over time, becoming simplified versions of much more complex lives. Still, what remains clear is that these women occupied a unique position. They were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. Instead, they lived in the space between, a space shaped by attention, expectation, and contradiction, and in that space, they left behind traces that still draw curiosity today. Not because they were perfect examples of anything, but because they revealed how unstable Victorian judgments could be, how quickly society could shift between admiration and condemnation, and how easily a life could become a story shaped more by perception than by truth. As we move deeper into these hidden histories, we begin to see that influence in Victorian London did not always come from formal positions or titles. Sometimes it came from presence, from visibility, from the ability to exist in spaces where expectations were still being written, and for a few women, that was enough to leave a lasting impression on the world around them, even if the world itself never fully understood them. As London moves deeper into its quiet night, and the final echoes of the day dissolve into fog and gaslight, the city begins to feel less like a place, and more like a collection of memories layered upon one another. Every street has seen countless footsteps, every building has held countless stories, and every shadow seems to carry something that was never fully recorded, because history, as we know it today, is never complete. It preserves certain names, certain events, certain voices that were considered important enough to remember, but it leaves much behind, especially the quieter lives, the everyday moments, the stories that never reached official records. In Victorian London, this forgetting happened constantly, not always intentionally, but inevitably. A city growing as fast as London could not preserve everything, and so many lives passed through it like passing light across fogged glass, visible for a moment, then gone. Within the streets we have been walking through, there were countless women whose lives were never written down in detail, not because they were unimportant, but because their importance was not recognized. In the way history often chooses to define it, some lived brief lives in overcrowded districts, working long hours, sharing small rooms, navigating the constant uncertainty of urban survival. Others remained in the same neighborhoods for years, their routines becoming part of the rhythm of the street itself. Shopkeepers would recognize their faces, neighbors would exchange quiet greetings, and yet, even these familiar lives rarely left detailed records behind. Instead, what remains today are fragments, a name in a census record, a brief mention in a newspaper notice, a passing reference in a ledger, tiny pieces of lives once full and complex. And from these fragments, we attempt to reconstruct meaning. But something is always missing: the feeling of a conversation, the tone of a laugh, the weight of a difficult decision made late at night. Victorian streets themselves hold a kind of memory. If one could stand still long enough, it might feel as though echoes remain beneath the surface, not supernatural, but human, the accumulation of countless ordinary moments, people walking home in the rain, children playing near doorsteps, women sharing stories beside candlelight, men returning from long days of labor, all of it blending together into something that can no longer be separated. And yet, the official records rarely reflect this fullness. They focus on structure, on events, on outcomes, but not on the texture of daily life, which is why so many stories feel incomplete when viewed from the present. We see outlines, but not the emotional depth within them. Still, within those outlines, something remains, a sense of presence, a reminder that these streets were never empty, never silent, never without meaning. Even in their most forgotten corners, there were lives lived fully in their own way, with their own struggles, their own joys, their own private moments that never reached public awareness. And perhaps that is what makes Victorian London feel so distant and so close at the same time. Distant, because so much has been lost. Close, because the emotions that shaped those lives remain familiar: hope, fear, love, uncertainty. These have not changed with time, only the world around them has. As we continue through this hidden narrative, we begin to understand that history is not only what is preserved, it is also what is missing, and sometimes, what is missing tells us just as much as what remains. As the final stretch of London's night settles into deep silence, and the gas lamps outside flicker softly against the thinning fog, we arrive at a quieter, more uncertain moment in this long story, a moment not defined by beginnings, but by endings, for every world, no matter how hidden or carefully maintained, eventually begins to change, sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly, and sometimes in ways that leave very little behind. In Victorian London, the hidden houses we have followed did not exist outside of time. They were shaped by it, by shifting laws, changing social attitudes, economic pressures, and the slow transformation of the city itself over the years. Neighborhoods evolved, streets were rebuilt, population shifted, and the rhythm of urban life moved forward, whether or not the old structures were ready to follow. Some houses closed quietly, without announcement, without record. Doors simply remained shut one day, and never opened again. Curtains that once glowed with candlelight grew still, windows gathered dust, and interiors that once held conversation and movement fell into silence. Other closures were more gradual. Residents left one by one, some moved to different parts of the city, others returned to uncertain futures elsewhere, a few simply disappeared into the vastness of London, where countless lives overlapped without ever fully connecting. And as people left, the structure of these hidden worlds slowly dissolved, not through a single event, but through steady change. Yet even after closure, traces remained, furniture left behind, faded wallpaper, empty rooms that still seemed to hold echoes of past routines. In some cases, buildings were repurposed, transformed into ordinary homes, shops, boarding houses, their previous lives concealed beneath new layers of paint and purpose. The city, after all, rarely erased itself completely. It adapted, reused, forgot quietly, and continued forward. For those who once lived within these walls, endings were rarely simple. Some departures brought relief, a sense of distance from earlier years. Others carried uncertainty, questions about what came next, and for many, the past remained something carried privately, not spoken aloud, but remembered in fragments. Victorian society itself also changed. Attitudes toward morality, labor, and urban life evolved over time. New reforms emerged, public discussion shifted, and what was once hidden in silence gradually became part of broader social awareness, not fully understood, but no longer entirely unspoken. Still, the transition was uneven. Some spaces disappeared quickly, others lingered longer than expected, and some transformed so gradually that their original form was almost forgotten. But history often leaves behind an interesting pattern. What disappears publicly does not always disappear entirely. Memories remain, stories persist, and traces survive in unexpected places. A diary entry, a newspaper line, a building that still stands in altered form, or a street whose name quietly carries echoes of another time. And so even when the doors closed, the world they belonged to did not vanish completely. It simply changed shape, as all things eventually do. There is something quietly reflective in this kind of ending, not dramatic, not sudden, but slow, almost imperceptible, like a candle finally burning down after a long evening. The light does not vanish instantly. It fades, gradually, until only memory remains, and in that fading light, we are left with questions rather than conclusions. What remains of a world when its doors are closed? Is it gone? Or does it continue in another form, within memory, within imagination, within the traces left behind? And perhaps the answer is not fixed. Perhaps it changes depending on who is remembering, or what is being remembered. For in the end, closure is never just an ending, it is also a transformation. As the last traces of Victorian night begin to soften into the first light of dawn, and the fog over London slowly thins into pale, drifting silence, we arrive at the end of this journey, but endings, as history often shows us, are never truly final. They are pauses, moments where memory gathers itself, before fading into something quieter. The world we have walked through together was never just a story of hidden rooms or closed doors. It was a story of people, of lives lived. In the narrow space between visibility and silence, between judgment and survival, between what was spoken and what was never said aloud, in Victorian London, thousands of women moved through a city that was vast, overwhelming, and constantly changing. Some were remembered in records, many were not, but all of them existed within the same streets, under the same fog, beneath the same gaslight that shaped the rhythm of the night. It is easy, from a distance in time, to see only labels, to reduce lives into categories, into simplified narratives that feel neat and understandable, but reality was never neat, it rarely is. Each woman carried a private world that no record fully captured, a world of memories, decisions, relationships, moments of kindness, moments of uncertainty, and countless ordinary hours that never made it into history books. Some lived briefly, others endured for years, some found stability in unexpected places, others continued searching for it throughout their lives, and many simply adapted, as human beings always do, to the circumstances around them. What remains most striking is not only the difficulty of their lives, but their persistence within them, the ability to continue, to adapt, to form friendships, to find laughter even in uncertain times, to imagine futures, even when those futures felt unclear. Victorian society often preferred to look away from these complexities, to simplify what was difficult to understand, but time has a different way of remembering. It preserves fragments, not always in order, not always complete, but enough to remind us that behind every vague reference, there was a person who once walked through real streets, who once felt real emotions, who once lived days that felt as real to them as ours feel to us now, and perhaps that is the quiet truth at the center of this entire journey. That history is not separate from humanity, it is made of it, layered, fragile, and endlessly complex. As the modern world continues far beyond these old Victorian streets, the echoes of those lives remain in subtle ways. In architecture that still stands, in stories passed down, in the changing shape of cities that never stop transforming, and in the imagination of those who still wonder what life was really like behind closed doors, because even now, we are still trying to understand, still trying to piece together fragments of lives that were never fully recorded, still trying to hear voices that time has softened, but not completely erased. And as we close this journey, we are left not with answers alone, but with awareness that every era holds hidden stories, every city carries unseen lives, and every quiet street may once have held worlds far more complex than they appear. So when we think of Victorian London, we are not only thinking of history, we are thinking of people, and those people, in all their struggle, resilience, and humanity, are what remain, even now, even here, as the fog finally lifts, and the night becomes memory.